one of my favorite childhood memories growing up, and if you're a baseball fan, you'll remember this story, was the summer of '98. If you're a baseball fan, you remember the summer of '98 very well, because that was the summer that both Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa chased Roger Maris's single-season home run record of 61 home runs in a single season. To me, that was when I first started actually paying attention to baseball. I was about 11 years old at that point. I really started to follow the pro leagues, just really enjoyed every bit of it. And everything about that summer was magical, because every time one of those two guys came up, whether it was Mark McGwire or Sammy Sosa, every time one of those guys came up, you could just feel the electricity in the building or in the room start to build a little bit. You started to have people wondering if this was going to be the night that he was going to advance farther towards that record. And right towards June, July, right at the beginning of August, that's when things really started to pick up. Because that's when it was not a matter of if Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire would break Roger Maris's single-season home run record, but when. And that was also this time period, right around August, late July, that my dad started VCRing every single one of those games, because he wanted to know when it was going to happen. That way he could go back and watch it over and over and over again. And I remember it like it was yesterday. It was sometime, I think, August, September. I don't remember the exact date, so I guess I don't remember like it was yesterday. That was an awful statement to make. But I remember what we were doing. My dad was playing one of those adult league softball games, and we had a TV in our full-size van at that point, which was remarkable at that time period. We had a TV in our full-size van, and it happened earlier that day, or later that night, something like that. We watched it in the car. That's the only thing I remember like it was yesterday. But I remember watching it. And when Mark McGwire came up to bat, and he hit that home run, it was number 61, he started to round those bases, and he came out on home plate. I'll never forget, this I will never forget actually, that one of the first things he did when he came around home plate was he reached down and he picked up his kid, who was a bat boy for them, lifted him up on his shoulders, and ran pretty much all the way right around that little dugout area, right around that home plate area, and just erupted in the applause that was there in that stadium, because he had finally broken what at that point was almost a 40 or 50 year record. Not much longer after that, Sammy Sosa would eventually break that record, both of them ending the year with right around 69, 70 home runs. Of course, we all remember infamously Barry Bonds breaking that record a couple years later. I choose to forget that part of baseball history. But that summer for me was absolutely magical on any number of levels. And then 2005 happened. 2005 hit, and both Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa were called in front of the Senate hearing to account for the things that they were alleged to have done during that magical season. The most notable one being the Balco steroid scandal that broke out, and which point these two were the focal point of that. One of the people that's not listed on the screen, as you can see there, Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, you have Kurt Schilling off to the side there, you have Rafael Palmeiro. One of the people that's not mentioned is Jose Canseco. He's off to the far outside of the picture. I don't like him either. He's kind of in that same league as Barry Bonds. But that's when the Balco steroid scandal broke. And that was when every record that had been in existence for the last 10 or 15 years, when steroids really started to take a grip on the league, that's when everything began to be called into question. And all of a sudden, that magical summer of '98, when baseball was so alive, when it was at the cream of the crop, when it was the national pastime, and every night was magical, that's when it all started to fall a little bit. That moment of Mark McGwire carrying his son on his shoulders didn't mean as much anymore, because you started to associate that with him cheating. And Sammy Sosa, who for some reason all of a sudden forgot English, if you watched that Senate hearing, over and over again, all he said was, "My English isn't very good," even though he's been in America for 10 plus years at that point. What you remember from looking at that Senate hearing was just how amazing their fall from grace was. And Mark McGwire, who was this national hero, who was on posters, who was on cereal boxes, and who was in video games, all of a sudden he was the national pariah. No longer was he this epitome of baseball's history and the love of summer. All of a sudden now, he was known as the guy who cheated. And who cheated to get to the very top, to break what is in baseball one of the most hallowed records that will ever exist within the confines of baseball. It's amazing and incredibly tragic at the same time when heroes fall, is it not? When people that you grow up idolizing, when people that you know to be immoral, people that you believe to be unstoppable, whenever those people all of a sudden don't seem so unstoppable anymore. When people that you associate with such grand moments of your life that you really tend to gravitate towards, when all of a sudden their deeds and their lifestyle doesn't seem to reflect that mythology in your mind. And you begin to think of them as less than human. We talked about this a little bit last week, but when you recount the story of Samson, somebody who was a fantastically powerful figure and had a litany of stories up until his name, just doing amazing things, and one that comes to the mind most often for me is him for some reason picking up the gates of that city and carrying them to the top of the hill and depositing them. For whatever reason, he decided to do that. And in the very next chapter, you had him falling prey to the wiles of a woman named Delilah. You have several of those stories throughout Scripture of people that are enormously powerful figures that fall from grace. Peter is another one. Peter, who was right there by Jesus' side time after time after time again, not only falling victim to the idea of not knowing who Jesus is, but also in Galatians chapter 2, playing the hypocrite. It's just insurmountable. But one of the tragic figures, at least in my mind, when you look over and over throughout Scripture, is the story of David. Because what you start with when David in 1 Samuel chapter 16 is this young boy that just seems to come out of nowhere, who picks up 5 smooth stones from a river, puts them in his sling, and takes on a 13-foot warrior champion named Goliath. And in a matter of minutes, he puts one of those rocks in his sling, he hurls it towards the Goliath, or towards the giant, hits him in the forehead, sinks into his head, the giant falls over, he takes over the gigantic sword, cuts off his head, and that's the end of Goliath. And from that point forward, to the end of 1 Samuel, through most of 2 Samuel, you have story after story after story of where David, over and over again, is playing the champion. Right there alongside, right there alongside God, doing what he wants him to do, having victory after victory, seemingly insurmountable. And then 2 Samuel chapter 11 happens. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, where all of his army is off to war, then you have David showing up on top of his roof, looking over across the way at a woman named Bathsheba, who happened to be bathing, and he falls victim not only to the temptation of adultery, but also murder, lying, and a big cover-up scheme. And right there at that point, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, is where you begin to see this fantastically powerful figure known as David, his mythology start to crumble a little bit. No longer is he known as David the unstoppable, David the righteous. Now he's known as David, the guy who failed, the guy who messed up, the guy who did something really, really, really bad. And that's the problem with these types of heroes. That's the problem with these types of guys. Whenever you see somebody like David, who is so strong, and yet appears to fall so hard. It all comes to a head kind of in 2 Samuel chapter 12. If you would flip over there. 2 Samuel chapter 12, as David is completely, for whatever reason, oblivious to the sin that he's committed. He goes at least 9 months without even recognizing, it seems like, recognizing the sin that he was embroiled in. It takes Nathan showing up at his doorstep to remind him of what had happened. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, or 2 Samuel chapter 12, after Nathan recounts this parable to him, designed to prick David's heart to understand what he had done, starting in verse 7, this is when Nathan begins to apply it towards David. And he says, Nathan then said to David, "You are the man, the one mentioned in this parable, who took the little ewe lamb from the guy who had absolutely nothing, and gave it to the guy who had everything." In 2 Samuel chapter 12, starting in verse 7, "You are this type of man, you are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, it is I who anointed you king over Israel, and it is I who delivered you from the hand of Saul." And this is the most important verse, or the most telling verse at least, rather in verse 8 in my opinion. He says, "I also gave you your master's house, your master's wives into your care, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah." And listen to this, "And if that had been too little, I would have added to you many more things like these." To me, one of the most telling aspects of David's sin is not so much what he says in the first couple of those, or parts of those verses, although that is telling, but what he says in the second half of verse 8, "I gave you all these things. You were blessed abundantly. And if that had not been enough for you, I would have given you so much more. Why then did you look across the way and take somebody who was not your wife, have an affair with them, and then kill their husband to cover the whole thing up?" Listen to verse 8. He says, "I also gave you your master's house." Verse 9 rather. "Why have you then," verse 9, "despised the word of the Lord by doing evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with a sword. You have taken his wife to be your wife, and you have killed him with the sword of the sons of Ammon." There's the litany of crimes that David then is exposed to. All the things that he has done wrong. But the most pivotal part there in verse 9, at least the most telling aspect of what David had done, he had done a lot of things wrong, is contained within the first part of there, verse 9. "Why have you despised the word of the Lord by doing evil in his sight?" Make no mistake about it, there was a lot of people that David did wrong in 2 Samuel chapter 11. If you read 2 Samuel chapter 11, and especially read the way his relationships with people would change over the course of the rest of 2 Samuel, there was a lot of people that were affected by that. Most notably Uriah the Hittite, who lost his wife for just trying to do the right thing. He wasn't trying to do anything immoral. He was a victim of David's cowardice and of David's immorality. You have the victim of Bathsheba, who probably was obviously a willing accomplice in a lot of this, but didn't really do herself any favors more oftentimes than not. You have one of the other victims being the unborn child. You have generations of David's family that would be affected after this. You have the palace guards that understood and saw what David had done when they started sending messengers back and forth to Bathsheba. They obviously were privy to everything. You have Joab. When you look at Joab's relationship, especially in 2 Samuel chapter 12, as it increases or as it develops over the course of the rest of that book, Joab's relationship with David was never the same after this incident in 2 Samuel chapter 12. Whereas Joab was right there with him, time after time again, being his right-hand man, being his commander in the field. Joab, from that point forward, would start to show signs of unrighteousness at times. Start to show signs of distrust towards David that didn't seem to be there beforehand. And so when you look at 2 Samuel chapter 11, you can make the statement, yeah, he hurt a lot of people, and he affected a lot of people with what he had done. But the first and foremost, the one that he hurt the most, was God. Look with me, if you would, in Psalm 51. Psalm 51 occurs after Nathan has left David's side. Psalm 51 is where you have, in my mind, one of the most heartfelt and emotional prayers, psalms, whatever you'd like to describe it specifically, that you find within the course of the entire Bible. Because when you get to Psalm 51, what you have are the words of somebody who has completely broken down. Somebody who has lost everything. Maybe not physically to a certain extent, but he has lost everything emotionally. And he is throwing himself on the mercy of God's grace and God's throne, pleading with him in any way, form, or fashion to help him. In Psalm 51, starting in verse 1, listen to how David starts off this psalm. He says, "Be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness. According to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin." Verse 3, "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me." Listen to this in verse 4. "Against you, you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified when you speak, and blameless when you judge." When you look there, especially at verse 4, what David is talking about in Psalm 51, especially in verse 4, is, "Against you, you only have I sinned." He's not eliminating everybody else. He's not trying to excuse his actions by saying, "I never did Uriah the Hittite any bad," or "I never wronged Bathsheba by any means." What he's saying is, against you, you are the primary one that I've sinned. If you remember, Joseph makes a very similar argument whenever Mrs. Potiphar, whatever her real name was, whenever Mrs. Potiphar shows up at Joseph's side and tries to seduce him. Do you remember what Joseph has to say? Joseph says, "How can I do this great evil and sin against my God?" Never mind Potiphar. How can I do this great evil and sin against God? When we talk about sins in that type of nature, the way that David does, the way that Joseph does, that's when we begin to understand what sin really is. We may lie to somebody, we may steal from somebody, and those things are wrong. But the real person that we're affecting with that on a much more deeper spiritual basis is God. We're affecting our relationship with Him. We're affecting our standing with Him. And so when David says here in Psalm 51 and verse 4, "Against you, you only have I sinned," what he's outlining is the direct target of his sins. These other people notwithstanding, he has broken his relationship with God. And that's something you can tell from David's words after Nathan's parable that he was intimately aware of. The question is that something that we're intimately aware of? I fear too oftentimes whenever we do something wrong, whenever we make a mistake, we wrong somebody, we sin in whatever way, we oftentimes go to other people to try and make that right. And we should. But do we spend enough time on our knees asking God to keep us and to forgive us and draw us close to Him as David did here in Psalm 51? This prayer is not a prayer to Uriah. This psalm is not a psalm towards Bathsheba. This is a plea towards God. And that's all it is. I want to make a quick note though. If you look at Psalm 51 and verse 5, a lot of people have attempted to kind of excuse David's actions. Psalm 51 and verse 5 by a lot of people has led some people to think that what David is advocating here is the concept of original sin. You look at Psalm 51 starting in verse 5, he says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me." What a lot of people will try to testify is the reason that David did this was because he just had to do it. He was raised in original sin. This was a part of who he was. He could not help but sin. I don't believe that. First and foremost, when you look at the verses that are up on this board, we won't read all of these verses, but look at this one in Ezekiel chapter 18. When you look at Ezekiel chapter 18, what Ezekiel teaches in this chapter, especially in the first 4 verses, he would talk about it several times throughout it. But what he teaches in the first 4 verses of Ezekiel chapter 18 is that nobody else is responsible for your sin except for you. There was a Catholic idea and there's some kind of a Calvinistic idea, the idea of hereditary depravity. There's this Calvinistic Catholic idea that the reason I sin is because Adam did. And because Adam sinned, not only do I have his sin contained there within my soul, but I also have the tendency and the drive towards sin. I can't help but do it. Ezekiel chapter 18, listen to God's response here towards this idea. Ezekiel chapter 18, I wish the New Testament people, the people that are around in Jesus' time, would have read this as well. Ezekiel chapter 18, starting in verse 1, it says, "The word of the Lord came to me, saying, What do you mean by using this proverb concerning the land of Israel, saying that the fathers eat the sour grapes, but it is the children's teeth that are set on edge?" Verse 3, "As I live, declares the Lord God, you are surely not going to use this proverb in Israel anymore. Behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son is mine. The soul who sins will die." What Ezekiel lays out there in Ezekiel chapter 18, those first 4 verses, is that if you sin, it is your fault and yours alone. Now understand that Adam committed a great transgression and brought sin into the world whenever he ate that fruit and was cast out of the garden. But we do not contain Adam's sins within ourselves any more than you contain my sins. And what Ezekiel chapter 18 teaches, there in verse 4 especially, the soul that sins, that shall die. Where that has specific application in Psalm 51 and verse 5 is, David sinned, therefore David is now reaping the punishments of that sin. When you talk about this idea of original sin, you can't help but escape the idea that sinfulness comes from understanding which grows by age. Isaiah chapter 7 verses 15 through 16 is a direct reference towards Jesus, a Messiah type of prophecy, where he talks about a person being old enough to understand the difference between good and evil. We understand, of course, that when you're 2 or you're 3 years old, as much as we would like to believe that kids that old know exactly what you're doing, as much as we would like to believe that a 2-month-old knows that he's keeping his parents awake all night, we understand, of course, that they don't know that. We understand that it takes time for you to understand the difference between right and wrong. We talk about oftentimes, I don't know if we talk about it too much here, but that phrase gets thrown around a lot, the age of accountability, as if it's some kind of magical age. The only thing that phrase represents is when a child, for whatever age he is, whether he's 6 or whether he's 10, or I don't think it gets too much older than 12 or 13 maybe, but whenever they finally start to understand the difference between right and wrong, understand to do right, understand not to do wrong. That's the understanding that comes from age. And so this whole idea of the whole Catholic idea of baptizing infants for sins that were done by Adam 5,000 plus years ago, it just doesn't make sense. Because it's not just from God, for one. I also understand that our spirits are given to us by God, not our parents. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 talks about how our spirits will return to God who gave them to us in the first place. Ask yourself if God would give us sins that were flawed, or souls that were flawed with sins already. That doesn't make sense. Never mind the fact that when Jesus is talking to us about kingdom citizens, who does he hold up as model citizens? Children. Also keep in mind that Jesus, being a human on this earth, if we're going to take this logic out fully, what does it necessitate about Jesus? That he had sins as well. And yet Hebrews teaches us that he was in all things, yet without sin. Ladies and gentlemen, this idea of Psalm 51 and verse 5, teaching the idea of original sin, is not any more true now than it was then. And what David is teaching there in Psalm 51 and verse 5 is the idea that the world, the environment in which he was raised, was corrupt, just as it is in today's world. If you walk outside and you walk in the mall, I don't guess we have mall anymore, but if you look at TV, if you read magazines, what the world is trying to get you to do is sin over and over again. And what he teaches us, or what he talks about in Psalm 51 verse 5 is, when I was brought forth with iniquity, and sin my mother conceived me, he's talking about the environment that he's in. Possibly the tendency towards sin, how we oftentimes want to sin because it's the easier thing to do. But I believe him talking about the culture in which he was raised. Regardless of which way you take it, one thing's for sure, and one thing is understood by David, is that he alone was responsible for his sin. And that is without excuse. You get back to Psalm 51 though, understanding that idea, that he's responsible for his own sin, which I think all of us would do well to remember. Oftentimes the first thing we want to do whenever we sin is try to blame somebody else. Well, it was Howard's fault. Howard tempted me to sin. Howard's the one that's wrong. We'll try to pass it off on somebody else. Understand that we are responsible for our own sin, I think, is the big part of it. When you look at Psalm 51, what it is from that point forward, actually pretty much the whole psalm, is a testament and a rubric for how to pray for forgiveness. Literally from the lips of David himself. Look at Psalm 51 again. Notice the phrase that he uses here in this passage. Psalm 51, starting in verse 7. Listen to the things that he has to say here in Psalm 51. Psalm 51, starting in verse 7. He says, "Purify me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me to hear joy and gladness. Let the bones which you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquities." Verse 10 is the capstone of this. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." What David is asking for in Psalm 51, verses 7 down to verse 10, is for God essentially to press the reset button on his life. Not just his physical life, not just his spiritual life, but also to create a new source of being within him. Create in me a new heart, one that doesn't lean towards sin, one that doesn't want to go and do the things that are wrong, because I know they're wrong, but one that leans towards you. Create in me a clean heart. The phrases that he uses in verse 7 and 8, we use that phrase hyssop as a ceremonial brush that the judges, or the priests rather, would use to clean after the sacrifices were offered. And so when he says, "Purify me with hyssop," he's talking about that sacrificial idea, but purify me after those sacrifices have been made. Let me look towards you. Let me grow towards you. This cleansing by any means, or by no means, was a very easy process. Anybody who's gone through the aspect of repentance, asking for forgiveness, knows that it's not easy. But what David understands from Psalm 51 is it's absolutely necessary to get his life back on track with God. When you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 7, look at this. 2 Corinthians chapter 7. 2 Corinthians 7 would be referencing something that's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, talking about the one who had his father's wife. And there's a lot of different places we could go with that discussion. We're not even going to touch that today. But obviously what Paul describes, or what Paul commands for that person there in 1 Corinthians 5, is to put them out. Not to put them out for sheer enjoyment, but to put them out so that they can learn what they've done, know that it's wrong, and hopefully return them back to them. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul makes a little bit of an allusion to this, when in verse 5, he says, "For even when we came into Macedonia, our flesh had no rest, but we were afflicted on every side, conflicts without, fears within. But God," verse 6, "who comforts the depressed, comforted us by the coming of Titus. And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted in you." Talking about the comfort that he has in the church of Corinth. "As he reported to us your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced even more." There's a comfort there. There's an enjoyment there. Where's it coming from? Verse 8, "For though I caused you sorrow by my letter, I do not regret it." Though I did regret it for a while. "For I see that that letter caused you sorrow, though only for a little while. I now rejoice," verse 9, "not that you were made sorrowful, but that you were made sorrowful to the point of repentance. For you were made sorrowful according to the will of God, so that you might not suffer loss in anything through us. For the sorrow that is according to the will of God produces repentance without regret, leading to salvation. But the sorrow of the world produces death." Verse 11, "For behold, what earnestness this very thing, this godly sorrow has produced in you. What vindication of yourselves, what indignation, what fear, what longing, what zeal, what avenging of wrong, in everything. You demonstrated yourselves to be innocent in this matter." The church at Corinth was just like you and me. They had a lot of issues. I'm not saying we have a lot of issues. But as far as humans go, they're just like you and me. They have emotions, they have love, they have sadness, they have all different ranges of emotions. And so when Paul in 1 Corinthians 5 tells them to take that person who is embroiled in sin and remove them from the church, because a little leaven leavens the whole lump, part of the side effect and part of the main goal of that is to get that person to realize that what they're doing is wrong. But that wasn't easy on the church. That wasn't easy on the church at Corinth, to take that person whom they probably loved and probably had trusted in a lot of ways and push them outside of the church. And what Paul says here in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 is talking about this. "I'm sorry that I caused you sorrow. I'm sorry that made you sad. But the sorrow that it made you have was nothing compared to the joy of seeing that person returned back to God." Let me ask you this question, which pertains to Psalm 51. Do you think it overjoyed God? And I think this is an honest question. Do you think it overjoyed God to take David's son that he had with Bathsheba from him? Do you think that it caused God happiness to remove that life from the earth? Absolutely not. I don't think in any way, shape, or form God takes any kind of pleasure in taking the life of somebody that is from this earth. Understand, sometimes, especially when it pertains to adults, there's judgment necessary. But he didn't take give God any pleasure to take the life of that infant. But what did he understand? That David sinned, he had to be punished for that. And he had to understand what the cost and what the stake of what he had done was. I want you to look back at Ezekiel chapter 18. Ezekiel chapter 18, later in this same chapter, he talks about something that's interesting. We tend to look at God, I think wrongfully, as being this evil, well, maybe not evil, but maybe being this mean, blind, callous guy, or callous being, rather. I don't mean in any disrespect. But callous being that issues judgment and doesn't even think twice about it. We tend to think of God as issuing his judgments, and he does them, and he doesn't have any emotional attachment to them. But in Ezekiel chapter 18, listen to what Ezekiel teaches in verse 21. He says, if the wicked man turns from all his sins which he has committed and observes all my statutes, here's that responsibility of the soul to turn towards God itself, observes all my statutes, he practices justice and righteousness, he shall surely live, he shall not die. Verse 22, all his transgressions which he has committed will not be remembered against him, because of his righteousness which he has practiced, he will live. That's a glorious statement, because it talks about the cleansing that comes from repentance. Verse 23, though, is interesting. Because he says, do I have any pleasure in the death of the wicked, declares the Lord God, rather than that he should turn from his ways and live. What Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 23 asks is, do I take any kind of pleasure or satisfaction in issuing judgments and killing people that are wicked? And the answer to that is absolutely not. Any more than Paul, when he told the church at Corinth to remove that person from their midst, any more than he took kind of sick pleasure out of getting this guy out of there. Neither of them did. Neither of them were happy in that. But what did they both understand? They understood that in order for this guy to be saved, he had to understand what he did wrong. And when David looked at the loss of his son, the judgments of God, he remarks in 2 Samuel chapter 12, my judgment is just. He understands what he's done. And he understands how God feels about that. It would behoove us to understand how we feel about it as well. But that is the course of Psalm 51 and verse 7, why he says there in verse 10, create in me a clean heart. Help me to look towards you. Help me to do your will. Because that's ultimately the most important thing. After he prays for that, look back at Psalm 51. After he prays in Psalm 51 to cleanse his heart, listen to what he has to say here in verses 11 and 12. He says, do not cast me away from your presence. Don't take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and sustain me with the willing spirit. Do you hear what he's asking for there in verses 11 through 12? What he's asking for is not to be pushed away from God, but for God to bring him close to him. He's asking for God to take David and bring him closer to his bosom, which is polar opposite than what most of us want to do whenever we sin. When you think about it, at the very beginning, the very first sin that occurred when Adam and Eve, when they ate of that fruit, whether it was an apple or whatever else is that we can have an argument about later if you would like to, when they first ate of that fruit, what was their natural response? To run and hide themselves away from the presence of God. And God still saw them. Whenever Jonah was told to go to Nineveh to prophesy against them and to teach them about repentance, where did he go? The only reason I remember where Nineveh was is because the only reason I remember where Tarshish is because it's the exact opposite direction from where Nineveh was. He was supposed to go east. He went on a boat and got to the far west of the Mediterranean, or was trying to go there at least. Whenever Judas understood that he had betrayed innocent blood, and I don't know if there is an understanding of quite to the extent of what he had done, but when Judas understood that he at least had betrayed innocent blood, what does he do? He goes out into the darkness and he hangs himself. Ask yourself the question, what had been different, or how could the story of the gospel have been different? If instead of Judas running into the darkness and hanging himself, if he had turned and ran into the arms of God. Ask yourself that question. How the gospel would have been different had that event occurred. And whenever we sin, whenever we've done something wrong, and all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, no one's holier than anybody else. We've all sinned. But when we sin, what do we oftentimes want to do? We want to hide from God, at least metaphorically speaking. We don't want to pray towards him. We don't want to have anything to do with him because we're utterly ashamed of what we've done, or at least we should be. And yet David here in Psalm 51 verses 11 through 12 is not asking for God to remove him from his presence, but to draw him in closer, to bring me close to you, to help me to be near you. How many songs do we sing that are in our songbooks that talk about the nearness of God to us? We sang one on Wednesday night. James led us on Wednesday night. The song, Nearer My God, Still Thee, or To Thee. Nearer, still nearer. We have songs such as Let Me Live Close to Thee Each Day. We have songs such as Hide Behind the Cross. How many more songs do we have in our songbook where instead of asking to be removed from Him, we are drawing closer to Him, which is exactly what we should be doing. In Acts the 17th chapter, whenever Paul was talking to the Athenian philosophers, people who had no real concept of God, they had a concept of a God, the unknown God. But their concept of God was polar opposite than what it should have been. And in Acts chapter 17, as he is talking about God and how the necessity for them to be His people, to be obedient to Him, listen to what he has to say here in verse 24, talking about the relationship of Jehovah to these people. Acts chapter 17, starting in verse 24, he says, The God who made the world and all things in it, since He is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. It's talking about the power that He has. Verse 25, Nor is He served by human hands, as though He needed anything. And He Himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. That's a very generous, benevolent God. Verse 26, And He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. Verse 27 is the pivotal part. That they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. When Paul stands in front of the Athenian philosophers and talks to them about God, he doesn't talk to them about a Jehovah that's far off in the distance. He talks about the necessity of groping for them, looking for them, wandering around, stumbling, trying to find Him. When the truth of the matter, as he says there in verse 28, is He's not that far from each one of us. Oftentimes, if we would just reach out, of course, metaphorically speaking, spiritually speaking, if we would just reach out our hands towards Him, 10 times out of 10, He would reach back towards us. And yet, how often do we ignore that? How often do we not preach that message? How often do we not think about that when we're embroiled in our sin? We need to be drawing closer to God. The temptation is to go away from Him. But when we're embroiled in sin, we're so far removed from Him because of the sin that we've done, we need to be drawing close to Him. David understood that. He also prayed there, verses 13 through 16, to set him free. In Psalm 51, starting in verse 13, listen to what he has to say here. He says, I will teach transgressors your ways after all these things, and sinners will be converted to you. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God, the God of my salvation. Then my tongue will joyfully sing of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. For you do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. What is David asking for in Psalm 51? Not to be free from the yoke of the world, not to be free to do whatever he wants to, but to be free to tell of the mercies of God. When we talk to people about the gospel, when we evangelize, something that we talk about so often here, the reason that we evangelize, the reason that we spread the gospel is because we understand what God has done for us. And in Psalm 51, when David is talking about this very idea, he's talking about breaking free from the yoke of this sin, having that forgiveness, having the clean heart, drawing him closer to Him. Those are the things that David is going to share with other people. And those are exactly the things that the world today, by far, needs. Let's look at one final verse in Mark the 8th chapter. Mark 7, rather. Mark chapter 7. In Mark chapter 7, I love these little stories where Jesus heals people. And then they go out and do something that's completely emotional. Jesus asked them not to, not commanded, I don't think necessarily, but asked them not to. And that they couldn't help but act in a positive manner. Obviously not if it's immoral. I don't take pleasure in those kinds of stories. But I love this story, Mark chapter 7. I guess I just love this one. Mark chapter 7. Starting in verse 31, it says, Again he went out from the region of Tyre, talking about Jesus, came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, within the region of Decapolis. They brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty. And they implored him to lay his hands on him, talking about Jesus laying his hands on this mute man. Verse 33, Jesus then took him aside from the crowd by himself, put his fingers into his ears after spitting, touched his tongue with the saliva, which is a very interesting way to perform a miracle. Looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he sighed to him, Epaphratha, that is to say, be open. And his ears were open, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. Now listen to this in verse 36. He gave them orders not to tell anyone. That was what Jesus wanted to happen. Later you would find in the Gospels he did that because the time of his departure had not yet come. His hour was not yet there. Listen to the response of these people in verse 36. The more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. And they were utterly astonished, saying, He has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. If you can imagine in your own mind, whether you or somebody you know had been deaf or had been mute, and all of a sudden you see that person now has the ability to speak and to hear, could you contain that message within you? Could you take that event, that story that had unfolded right before your eyes, and not put it on Facebook? Could you have not put it on Twitter, or the Tumblr, or the Reddit, or whatever it is that you use? Some people do because they don't like computers, and that's fine. But could you contain that story within you? Or would you have the exact same response as this person did when something amazing happens? You can't wait to share it with other people. And that's the exact same response that David had in Psalm 51. He talked about cleansing him from his sin, creating me a clean heart, draw me closer to you. And when those things happen, when I'm forgiven, when I'm close to you, I cannot wait to share this experience with everybody else. Same experience that each one of us had when we put Christ on through the waters of baptism. And whenever we err and we come back to him, those same experiences are repeated over and over and over again, because we speak of the grace that God has, his mercy, and his forgiveness that he has for each one of us. Reach out with your hand, ladies and gentlemen. God is not far from each one of us. And what David understood in Psalm 51 was that if he would simply look for him, God was ready and willing to give all the grace that he needed if he would turn back to him and repent. The question I have for you this morning is, will it take a sin on the scale of David and Bathsheba in order for us to get our life right with God? Oftentimes it takes things like what we saw last weekend with the tornado ripping through a major metropolitan area, killing 11 people and displacing more than 400 homes that are destroyed in the wake of its path. Those are the times that it's easy for us to wake up and see God. It's easy for us at those times in our life to wake up and see God for who he is, understand our necessity for salvation. But will it take a sin on the scale of David and Bathsheba and a loss on the scale of losing your son to turn towards him? Or will we open our eyes and be self-aware enough to look at our own souls, understand our need for God, understand where we erred, maybe on this, not on this scale, but understand where we had erred, and turn our lives back to him? I pray that it doesn't take this. And I pray that we would open our eyes to see our own personal sins and our need for salvation. If you have need of the gospel call, won't you come? I implore you to come as we stand, as we sing.